Hi, everyone. My name is Tony Domenico, and I'm a partner and co-chair of Fasken's Competition Marketing and Foreign Investment Group. And I'm joined here today by my colleague, John Pecman, who is a senior business advisor at Fasken. Hi, John.
Hey, Tony. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. So a brief word on Fasken and John. Fasken is Canada's leading law firm with offices across Canada. We practice all aspects of competition law, marketing, and consumer protection, as well as foreign investment and national security. John Pecman is the most immediate former commissioner of competition. And prior to joining Fasken, John spent over 34 years at Canada's Competition Bureau in various capacities, including the last 5 years as Commissioner of Competition. So really pleased to have an opportunity to have a great discussion with John today. So John, let's level set our discussion before we get started. Canada is experiencing enormous changes in competition law. There seems to be bipartisan political support for a complete overhaul of competition policy and enforcement in Canada. And we haven't seen change like this since the Modern Competition Act was enacted in the mid-1980s. So with this context, John, why is the Competition Act being amended?
So, Tony, these amendments stem from the public's concern with market concentration and high prices in our economy. So beginning with the rise of the big tech firms and digital markets, and then followed by more vigorous enforcement in countries such as Europe, the United States, and elsewhere, Canada, as a little known competition law, caught the public's attention like never before. The competition commissioner, Matthew Boswell, along with others, have persuaded policymakers that Canada needs more competition. The results we have now is an invigorated Competition Act by way of 3 expedited bills in 2 years, with all party support, as you mentioned, and the commissioner has described these changes as generational. The 3 tranches of changes generally strengthen the substantive provisions of the Act, increase penalties for wrongdoing, and creates a new right of private actions regime.
You said it well. And what I found most interesting through all of this is that there was bipartisan support. That's a rare thing among policymakers and parliamentarians in Canada. But you seem to have universal support with respect to some form of change. And many of these bills seem to have unanimous support from everyone, which was quite a departure because, as you would know best, but even when I started practicing competition law, not many people knew what I was doing and what this all was about, and had a hard time understanding what role competition policy had in the context of the broader economy. But more and more people are approaching me and you and others who practice competition law with a real sense of understanding it more and wanting to see the relationship that it has with all sorts of policy making in the country. So I think we can all agree that there has been a sea change with respect to the importance of competition law. And with that, we've seen a lot of change. So maybe we should segue now into that change and think through, okay, what are the major changes to the Competition Act in summary? I know there are lots of them, so maybe we can try to pick some highlights.
Yeah, just some of the highlights. Let's start with merger control, because that's an important facet of business. The efficiencies defense, which had previously allowed anti-competitive mergers to be approved under the law, has now been removed completely. There's rebuttable presumptions that have been introduced, which reverse the burden to merging parties to prove that the proposed merger is not anti-competitive before the competition tribunal. So both these changes now make it more challenging for large firms with market shares above 30% to merge with their competitors. Next, we have an extended scope along with this new 2-part test for abuse of dominance in that section now, this new 2-part test does not require proof of harmful competitive effects derived from the anti-competitive conduct. These are, there's now also large financial penalties for cases with the traditional 3-part test, which still requires the Bureau to show both anti-competitive intent and harmful effects for large firm conduct. The civil civil competitor collaboration provisions have also been strengthened. And this deals with non-hardcore cartel agreements. So think about strategic alliances and joint ventures between competitors. Now this provision covers agreements between non-competitors. What we're hearing a lot about are property control agreements, usually found in restrictive covenants, now fall under the ambit of the Competition Act. So this provision now includes new remedies such as structural orders that allow for the divestiture of assets and shares of companies and impose significant financial penalties. Also, you may recall that the wage fixing agreements and no poach agreements to not solicit or hire between employers are now criminalized. Plus, the Competition Bureau today is able to conduct formal market studies with the means to compel relevant information from businesses by court order. So again, this is new. This is something to be aware of. And as for the consumer protection provisions, there are now stricter prohibitions regarding ordinary selling price, drip pricing, which is, hidden fees, and unsubstantiated greenwashing claims. So the most significant change, in my view at least, is the creation of a meaningful right of private action regime for civilly reviewable matters that incentivize plaintiffs with disgorgement of profit awards, referred to as derived benefits gained from anti-competitive conduct by the defendant. So these are a lot of changes for business to digest, Tony.
Oh, you're absolutely right, John, and thank you for that. I think there's so much scope in all of this, ranging from significant changes to merger review, to unilateral conduct and competitor collaborations, and then morphing into sort of robust consumer protection regimes. And on top of that, you have introduction of a private right of action. And I agree with you, that being perhaps the most significant, because in Canada, historically, we've only had private rights of action arising out of criminal conduct under the Competition Act, and not meaningful civil remedies arising out of civil reviewable practices. And this will make Canada much more akin to the approach that's taken in the United States with respect to private rights of action being available for all conduct. And in thinking through some of these changes, the abuse of dominance change strikes me as pretty significant, because you're departing from arguably a rule of reason regime and moving, although it still is a civil reviewable practice, you can demonstrate an abuse of dominance just with the existence of control or dominance together with a practice of anti-competitive acts. Now, I appreciate that practice of anti-competitive act dynamic has a few components to it. But in theory, you can demonstrate that an entity is engaging in an abusive dominance position with the first two without having to demonstrate a lessening or prevention of competition. And I think that's pretty profound. And most recently, I would say that greenwashing is getting a lot of attention with the introduction of provisions that seem to try to introduce this notion of a performance claim regime, whereby if you make representations to the public that relate to environmental benefits of any sort, the onus to demonstrate substantial and adequate testing or substantiation, depending on the context, on the advertiser is a pretty profound change as well. So we can go on and on about this, and we will in due course talk about this in more detail. But needless to say, I think there's a lot of change that's gone on, and we've just touched on the highlights for that for now. So maybe moving on to our last point, John, what are the implications of all of this for Canadian business?
Yeah, these 3 rounds of unprecedented amendments clearly expand the scope of the Competition Act over business conduct. I think business can expect a more vigorous enforcement side of the Competition Bureau. You'll see a lot more of them in the future. And of course, this new private actions regime with financial incentives for plaintiffs creates significant litigation risks for businesses. So therefore, it's highly recommended that companies pay increased attention to their corporate compliance programs for Competition Act offenses, which, again, now carry a lot more punch. And finally, as the new private actions regime and the competitor collaboration changes do not come into force and effect for some time, but Canadian businesses still have an opportunity to assess their commercial arrangements and agreements and practices and take advice to reduce the risk of potential liability.
A great point, John. And I would say that we've been working with a lot of clients now to sort of revisit and look at their competition compliance guidelines. I think one of the biggest changes has been, moving from sort of traditional compliance programs, and perhaps we're very focused on criminal violations of the Competition Act and some civil aspects, to a much more robust program that incorporates many of the facets that will be touched on by the amendments, whether it ranges from the criminal component, and with the introduction particularly of wage fixing and no poach amendments, that being significant. But there's a whole robust set of civil provisions that I think need to be addressed, together with a new robust set of deceptive marketing provisions, all of which is highlighted by the dual private and public enforcement that will become the norm. So I think having regard to all of that, rethinking your corporate compliance program and making it more modern and robust, I think is a great investment to not only prevent competition offenses from taking place in the future, but it's something to point to as well in the unlikely event that you happen to be subject to scrutiny one way or another in the context of competition law. So lots to talk about, John, but we just don't have enough time for that. So let me just say thank you, John. This has definitely been a very informative discussion. This is a lot for our listeners to think about. And to learn more about the subject, I invite you to visit our website at fasken.com for any specific questions or feedback that you might have. So thank you again.
You're welcome. Thank you.